Healing Wisdom is made possible by members like you and sustaining members like Michael Brabowski. You can become a sustaining member of WOMR for as little as $15 a month. For more information, call 508-487-2619 or visit our website at WOMR.org, where you can learn more about legacy gifts and planned giving. You're tuned in to 92.1 WOMR FM Provincetown and 91.3 WFMR FM Orleans, the voice and spirit of Cape Cod. I bid you welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, chartered herbalist and psychic medium. Healing Wisdom explores mind, body, soul connections as we discuss the healing effects of the arts, metaphysical concepts, intuition, and the spiritual aspects of everyday living. Healing Wisdom begins in the heart. Our theme music is provided by Mystic Pete. Hello, Barbara Gail. Hello, listener.
Hello, Pandora. Nice to be with you here.
Wonderful to be with you. I am so happy for you to be here with us talking about the rich history of the tambourine, the frame drum, your background in dance and traveling around the world, and just your experience making music with people of all different backgrounds and musical traditions. Before we came on, we were talking about Isadora Duncan briefly, and you told me that you actually studied with both Gabrielle Roth and a disciple of Isadora Duncan. So that's pretty exciting.
Yes, starting right off from, I took the class with an Isadora Duncan dancer who had been a dancer with her when she was a child. And then as an elder woman, I was in college. I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And this woman was part of the 5-college consortium as a special guest teaching artist. And I, of course, had to sign up. I minored in dance when I was there, and I was dancing 5-6 days a week. So that was totally new to me, and what a special experience that certainly was. Gabrielle, on the other hand, even though I'm no expert of Gabrielle Roth, wow, I was on her teacher's path, her teaching path, her dancing path, for a number of years, for about 7 years. And I used to teach her rhythm wave. And so that I have a much deeper, visceral memory of those days.
You're a ceremonialist, a performer, a hand drummer, a dancer, a percussionist. You worked as a children's edu-tainer, a SpiritSinger, and a well-seasoned facilitator in group drum and dance experiences. And you also are the shop owner of Rhythm Inlet and Ukulele Place. So you've worked, you've done retreats, festivals, you perform at churches, synagogues, libraries, schools, conferences, camps, community centers, you name it. So you're just really all about building community and really getting everybody to feel comfortable making music.
We opened our drum and dance studio in September of 1995 in our barn in Mount Vernon, Maine, because I was inspired by these two remarkable teachers in my life, Gabrielle Roth, who I met in 1991. I had already had some exposure to her work thanks to one of her proteges, Chris Werner, who had brought the teachings to Maine, where I was living. In 1990, I met her and took a workshop, and then I immediately had to go to the source. This was it for me. I found something, and in 91, I was 29 years old, and I met Gabrielle, who told me to keep dancing with the angels, and I became obsessed with her and her work. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a teaching. Gabrielle was an edge walker who invited us all to dance and walk on the edges. So I was following her a lot, showing up all the time in New York for her workshops. And then 2 years later, I met Layne Redmond. So, that was March of 93, and I was 31 and Layne was 41. We were 9.5 years apart. They both have passed away, Gabrielle in 2012 and Layne in 2013. But I had this remarkable beginning to my world of the drum and the dance. Now, my background when I was in school was in the expressive arts as experiential education for personal and social transformation. Long title, that's how we roll in Hampshire. And it was very self-directed, that's how the programs go. And so I was really wanting to find some form of expressive arts path so that I could bring people on a journey that would change them on their personal levels, but also within a community level. I was really into the personal and social transformation already when I was 20 years old. So when I met Gabrielle, well, and I'd already studied the djembe a little bit. I took West African djembe with John McDowell, a jazz musician who had traveled to Gambia, West Africa, to get to the roots of jazz and brought it to Maine, of all places, because he was going to Maine for the summer to hang out with friends. It's a beautiful place to be in the summer. And so that's what he did, and they said, you should be teaching this stuff. So he started to teach. So in May of 88, I started drumming, and that was the exact same month I met my partner in life and work, my husband, Jeff Hanna. So I was already, into this stuff. And then I meet Gabrielle in 91, and then I meet Layne in 93, and I had these remarkable teachers, the shaman of the dance, or I guess we could say today, the Sha woman, the shaman of the dancing shaman, Gabrielle, and the priestess of the drum, Layne. And I came back from that remarkable weekend with Layne Redmond called When the Drummers Were Women, and I knew that I now had these two forms that I was ready to teach. And I had already done some teaching, because then, of course, friends always want to know, well, I have this little drum, how do I play it? Or, will you come teach a dance workshop in my space? And so as I was studying, I was just like sharing informally with friends, I was at a modern dance studio several times a week once I was living in Maine, and she knew what I was studying. She said, you gotta share some of this stuff with our class. So I did that too. But I came back from that weekend with Layne Redmond, and I knew this was it. This was my future. And so Jeff and I built a studio in our barn that opened in 95, and I started teaching. And actually, before I started teaching, my vision was even greater for the community. Here we were in rural Maine, but my vision included all the remarkable, talented people who choose to live in the state of Maine. It's a really unique place for creative and progressive thinkers and livers. And so I made my space available to other people who wanted to teach everything from authentic movement with Susan Shell. People who, are familiar with the roots of authentic movement would be familiar with her name, contact improvisation and authentic movement person who's been doing it for decades. And, anything else, astrology, the Enneagram, theater therapy, you name it. There were all kinds of classes and workshops going on in there for personal enrichment. And I started teaching as well. And at the beginning, we had like 16 different teachers and people coming for that. And that was really quite a thing to build community. It was the first time anyone in our area had heard of yoga. We had a yoga teacher. It was an exciting time, a very busy time. I was pulling a lot of all-nighters, and those were the days when newsletters were going out as a hard copy, not through there was no email, there was no internet, and it was just really very exciting and fun, and I met a lot of incredible people. And over time, the demand for my work started to take off. So there was less and less time and space for other teachers in my studio as I needed it more and more. And people were asking me, could you come and do this at our venue? Or are you going to offer anything for children? And being a kid person, I actually started off in college so I could be a third grade teacher. That was my favorite age. And so I was like, well, I guess I should do stuff for kids. So before I knew it, I was doing children's programs and working with various populations of people who have just special needs, physical, mental, emotional. And I would, my phone was always ringing and I would say, sure, I could do that. And then I'd hang up and go, how am I going to do that? And I'd have to conjure up a program. And I had so many other remarkable teachers along the way. I started soaking up everything that I could. A lot of drive time because it wasn't really happening in Maine. Layne told me to keep on drumming. She sent me a postcard after that very first weekend and said, it's not very often that I see someone with so much potential, so you need to keep drumming. I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? So I stayed with the djembe. And that was slightly available. A couple of friends of mine who had formed Inanna, Sisters in Rhythm, Judy Nielsen and Lizzie Director, shout out to them. They started teaching an hour and a half from my house, so I started going there every week. But then I knew that I needed more, and so I was traveling out of state for learning how to harness group rhythm. It's not just about drumming, and that's kind of, it's an interesting thing. People who follow the Layne Redmond legacy or the Gabrielle Roth legacy, a lot of these remarkable human beings who left powerful legacies after they've been gone and during their time on Earth. And since, just like the children's game telephone, their work can get a little bit distorted in what people think of Gabrielle's work or Layne and the drum. I have a lot of other opinions about it, sometimes controversial. But it's really just not all about the drum. We live our lives in rhythm. We are rhythmic beings, and that's what Layne taught us, to connect to the pulse of the mother's blood, the place from which we all began as we were gestating in our mother's wombs. That pulsing sound. It's not the heartbeat. If you think about it, the heart is up here and the womb is way down there. It's the pulse of the mother's blood where all of our sense perceptions developed. And then we're born into this rhythmic world with the cycles of the sun and the moon and the stars, and we live our lives by rhythm, even if it's an artificial one that we call a clock, and by the schedules of our workplaces and the schools that our children go to, etc. Gabrielle's mother tongue was rhythm. That's why she coined it, the 5 rhythms. And it's a dynamic, it's a vibration, it's a frequency, it's how we move and how we live. And so, the earth herself has a pulse. The pulse of granite has been measured. Yes, even granite has a pulse. So this is a truly rhythmic world and rhythmic universe, and everything comes down to rhythm. So yes, everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to drum with you. And it's like, but how do we share rhythm? How do we share vibration? How do we share frequency? And what does that mean? What does that look like? And so I'm always really wanting to move toward that. And Layne's teaching all about the drum, whether it was the tambourine, the frame drum with jingles, or the frame drums like I have back here that preceded the tambourine that were jingle-less. Her teachings were all just seated in ceremony. We would learn some rhythms, we would learn technique. Her technique was astounding to us all. Everybody's like, I don't sound like Layne. Nobody sounds like Layne. Only Layne sounds like Layne. And, they say, well, I can't. My students say, I don't sound like you. You're not going to sound like me, but I can help you to sound like you. that, to come to the drum, we bring our own rhythm. And then, yes, Layne would teach us the technique and she would teach us rhythm patterns. And then we would enter into a ceremonial space where the magic really happened. And Gabrielle took us, Gabrielle's work wasn't just about dancing to some cool music that starts off slow and then has a crescendo where we all get our yayas out and then we just dissolve into loving space. I mean, that's a beautiful thing, right? And yet that, I think, is what a lot of people think of when they think of Gabrielle Roth and her work, because that's what's so popular. And she really honored the holy DJ who could take people on that kind of journey. And yet it's not just about, the music was the midwife, but it was about the teachings of each of the 5 rhythms. She believed in the mystery. She was a living and breathing modern day mystic and wanted us to enter into the deep, dark mystery of our deepest, darkest selves in order to be our most authentic selves. And so she would have us not just dance until we were a bag of bones flailing around the dance floor, and that was part of it too, in order to shed everything and to sweat our prayers, but also to dance into our fear, to dance into our sadness, into our anger, into the utter chaos of our inner beings, and bring that angst into art so that then we can dissolve. It was all about dissolving the ego. And we need our egos in order to survive, but we have all of these characters in the bus that I find myself talking about a lot lately, these voices that we have, like Debbie Defensive is one of mine, who comes right up right away, she's always right there to respond. Well, what if I were to make art out of Debbie Defensive, put her out there and see that mirror as, oh, wow, that's part of myself, and hold that mirror up for you to see who is the Debbie Defensive in you. And then what's left after shedding all of these parts of ourselves? My fearful Francine and my really angry Andrew, all of these characters in me, we can always analyze where they all came from, our parents and our teachers and society and our peers and all that stuff. But actually, if we take these characters and turn them into art and set them aside from ourselves to then truly be present in the moment, whether we're being present for ourselves or present for one other or present for the family, the tribe, the community, the world. We all have our woundedness, so how do we turn that into medicine? And so for Gabrielle, the dance was the medicine. And that was a very brief way of describing her teachings, because she was, I just kept showing up, all of us who followed her and revered her and loved her and were terribly afraid of her, too, because she would just not let us get away with anything. Every time we showed up, everything that she said was new and different. Every time. It was so surprising. And Layne, another artist, Layne Redmond, remarkable. I mean, these pioneers, these brilliant, crazy artist pioneers who were just had to teach people. Layne was always evolving with her work. Any of us who followed her for any amount of time, you start out learning one thing, and then 8 years later, we're still with her, and wow, the work looks completely different depending on what projects she's working on now, what her passions were, what her obsessions were that she was diving into. And as any great teacher, they both observed their students and their followers and continued to evolve. So they were my teachers, and yet others like Barry Bernstein, who has also now passed, taught me how to bring rhythm into a community setting and how to hold the space in rhythm for a group and how to master the group mind through rhythm. Just remarkable. I kept showing up for his annual conferences that he organized with frame drummer and recording artist Randy Crafton and Bob Bloom, who was part of the Babatunde Olatunji Drums of Passion troupe out of New York. I mean, they're just incredible people, you know. And then me, who has this Brazilian Orisha called Oxóssi as my primary, who is the hunter for the community, who goes out and does the hunting and brings back the feast for the community. And for me, that was, what did I go out there and learn? What did I, get on a plane and get on a bus and get on a train and get behind the wheel of my car and go find these remarkable teachers who were many of them nationally known and even internationally known. And, Ubaka Hill, I have to mention her as well. I just kept showing up, and then I bring it back and start teaching in the community. And then, like you mentioned, all those venues, it was amazing. Some of those experiences truly moving, like to be asked to lead a rhythm circle for people at the West Side Neuro Rehab Center in Lewiston, Maine. I'd never done anything like that before, and these were folks who had suffered strokes or had been in some sort of accident where they had sustained spinal cord injuries and had very limited mobility and movement. And yet I could put a shaker in the hand, put a drum in their lap with a mallet. And I had this piece of rhythmic music that I had developed with children, and I thought I would do with them, and I call it the rain song, where it begins very quietly with misty, misty rain, and they find the quietest possible way to play their instrument. And then we move into pitter patter, and I'm playing my djembe, the mama drum, who's over here. And Jeff made this drum for me, actually. So I'll bring out the mama drum because I made my living from her. So she's my partner. And so I would, lead them into pitter patter, and they would play pitter patter, and then we'd have the thunder boomer, where everybody could get their yayas out and just wail away on whatever drum, bell, shaker, scraper, boomer, banger, dinger, donger, clanger, clanger that they had in their hands, these hand drums and percussion instruments from all over the world that I collected, mostly indigenous, ethnic, folkloric, made of natural materials based on what those people had in their backyards. And then we bring it back down to pitter patter, and then back down to misty, misty rain, where they would find the quietest possible way to play their instrument. And then I'd have someone turn the rain stick or strike a singing bowl. And we imagined the rainbow, the double rainbow would come out. And after I did that, I always play standing up. I play standing up, I think standing up, I teach standing up. And with that group from West Side Neuro Rehab, I had to sit down after we did that. I was so deeply moved by these people who made incredible music. Some of them had even lost the ability for speech. And here they were expressing themselves in a non-verbal way, and yet I knew exactly what they were saying and what they were feeling, and I could feel it all. And after the rain song with these folks who had just all this limited ability, I was deeply moved, and I just had to sit, and I didn't even know what to say. So, I've had a remarkable few decades, and I'm grateful to the people who kept showing up and to the phone calls that kept coming. a lot of everyday, a lot of special populations, but also a lot of everyday neurotic adults who just want to learn how to play this drum, or were drawn to the women's tambourine, the women's frame drumming, the Brazilian drumming that Jeff and I did together. There was a lot, and every age. And so I'm just truly grateful, because this was actually full-time for us, and I don't think anybody he's nuts and I'm crazy. I don't think anybody else would have liked to have embarked on such a journey of making a full-time career out of this. A lot of people do it on the side, but I was obsessed and had to keep on moving forward and had to keep sharing. And so our menu of programs was extensively long and fun. I loved the diversity. I thrived on it. And in the fall of 2015, decided to take a sabbatical. I didn't know what would happen from that, but I'm glad that I did, because now as I reemerge, everything is looking beautiful and different and exciting.
I'd love for you to speak to the rhythms, both Gabrielle's and your experience of that, because I'm also really curious about working with the rhythm in the group, because obviously, there's a synergy with every group, and that is even more amplified when people are channeling a rhythm and working together.
But yeah, the 5 rhythms are teachings in and of themselves, and each of the 5 rhythms, flow, staccato, chaos, lyrical, and stillness, are a wave, and then they begin again. It's a spiral through time, and we can go through a wave energetically, emotionally, physically, in a minute. We can go through a wave, and I don't mean just dancing, just energetically. We can go through a wave in an hour, in a week, in a year, and in a lifetime. Each of those 5 rhythms represents a phase of life. And there are rhythms within rhythms. There are, as a very flowing form of staccato, there's a very, there's a stillness even in chaos, and there's a very lyrical form of flow, so it's just, there are rhythms within rhythms. So it's very nuanced and complex. And they can represent a creative process, a career process, a love relationship process, a love-making moment. I mean, all of that. It's just a wave of energy, a frequency, a vibration, and it's a language that we can use and then embody through the dance and learn from the teachings behind each of the 5 rhythms. And each of these 5 rhythms also has like a shadow side, like, for flow, the circles and spirals. Well, it can kind of get so taffy and mud that it can become lethargy, so yeah, I mean, there's even in stillness, there's movement. Even upon the moment of death, there's movement. Breath and blood may not be pulsing through the body anymore, but the act of decay continues the movement in stillness. So there is stillness and movement. There's the still point in the chaos, and there's lots of movement happening in the decay of absolute stillness and death. So it can describe a lot of things, it's why it takes year after year after year of showing up. The other thing that was a huge part of the teaching of Gabrielle Roth herself was in the medicine of being present without a mask, and really whether I touched on this before, whether dancing alone with the self or with the universe, the source, whatever you choose to call all that is, and one other, that relationship, it carries over from the dance floor into our relationships with one another, and how we do that dance of a conversation or of a meal together, or anything, in that relational sense. And then also our relation to the family, to the tribe, to the world. And we all kind of have these woundedness in one or more of those three arenas that we find ourselves in as humans, as social animals. And as she said, that a woundedness in all three of those areas is a very wounded bird. But we bring to wherever we have these scars, and wherever we have these damaged wings, we come to the dance floor to dance that pain and to work through it in the presence of and being witnessed by others, and to actually witness someone else too. And in that comes the healing. And as we put our mind in our feet and put let the feet begin, then the body will follow. And the soul doesn't live in the body. I feel the body lives in the soul. The soul is much greater than that. And I've heard her son mention that as well. And so by putting the body in motion, and then the soul can begin to come through expressively, and it puts the psyche in motion. And so those riders on the bus that I was mentioning before, all those voices in our heads, they're not the bus, they're not the drivers of the bus. We want to give them a voice. I'm glad that I have Debbie Defensive. She keeps me safe when I need her to be, but I don't need her to like jump every time I'm being asked a question and how I come forward. And so how do we have all of those riders on the bus there and yet quieted? Well, if you put the body in motion, the psyche is in motion, and it begins to heal. And so that's, for me, what the practice was about. And my greatest spiritual practice really was in the teaching of the 5 rhythms, and teaching drumming as well. I because that's mostly how I made my living, was through the drum, and teaching and facilitating and guiding. But being on the dance floor and moving the energies of the group on the dance floor, wow. Because, not everybody wants to dance. Not everybody's comfortable in their bodies and dancing with others, but they'll get behind a drum and they'll drum, make noise.
I think that people long for drama. I think it's human nature to want to experience all of the different feels, all of the different feelings. And if we were just all euphoric, there would be no texture. There would be nothing to compare it to. You might even say there'd be no movement, because it would be like stagnating at one frequency or one vibration. And we demonize lower vibrations like for higher vibrations, but yet somehow the earth is a low vibration. I'm not quite sure about all of that. But
she's big. She's really big.
We're born of the Kundalini energy, which is, the first and second chakra energies. But I really feel that it, like when you're talking about the 5 rhythms, I'm thinking, well, maybe all of these emotions are, intrinsically connected to these different rhythms, and we need to feel these different rhythms, like we're so much part of everything. I've been really having a hard time learning more about otters and dolphins lately. Like, I always was kind of trying to think of nature as just this perfect higher consciousness, and like I was like, well, okay, but ducks, they have some like interpersonal issues. I'm like, I don't know if they're misogynistic or what's going on. So, and of course, because like, I'm very much a lover of the earth and ceremonies around the earth, but we have to also understand that not only human nature, but nature is complicated. Animal consciousness is complicated. Like, it's all complicated, and we need to work through and experience things authentically, not filtered through our intellectual selves and through our egos. We have to be more embodied. And a lot of mindfulness practices are helpful, but a lot of people have a hard time clearing the brain by just sitting still. And I really feel for a lot of people, movement is the answer, and music and rhythm, because it just immediately changes your frequency. It changes your brainwaves even to listen to it, the right and the left hemisphere moving together. It's just it's an antidote for PTSD. And then playing it builds neuroplasticity. And so it's so important, but also when you're dancing, you can embody all of the elements and all of the animals. Like with animals, we see ourselves as so separate from animal consciousness, and from trees and plants. We're like, oh, like, even in reverence, we can just see ourselves as so separate. But when you're moving in concert with, it's a symphony. We're part of a whole symphony. For our whole childhoods, growing up, and then people going directly into jobs where they have to sit pretty still for a good portion of the day, we're being trained out of our healing nature, our oneness with all that is, that we in our known universe, because everything is making music and melodies and pulsing. Everything is in a constant state of motion, including our very cells, and our atoms. There's, everybody heard about water. We're like 70% water, but like if you go down to a molecular level, it's like we're all air, we
are, it's air, yes, but it's energy, and it's vibration, and it's rhythm down to the quantum level. That's all there is. It's empty, it's space, and it's vibrating in rhythm. Yeah. And thank you for that teaching. Oh my gosh. Thank you for that teaching that you just presented. Yeah. And Gabrielle said, what do you want? A perfect world? How utterly boring. So yeah, it's perfectly imperfect in that way. You used the word perfect and perfection a few times. I don't know if you were aware, but yeah, that I caught that for sure. And yes. So yeah, that was a lot. Our cells are constantly moving and turning over and replicating and dying, and down to the cellular DNA level. And yeah.
Right. And I would like to say that people aren't honoring the death process. And I think that that's part of our healing nature, is to understand these many, many deaths, all times. But these deaths, on a cellular level, it's how we stay healthy. Everybody has some atypical cells in their bodies, and frequency is a huge healing modality. And it's something that has been known for a long time, and I think that before we all had lights and all of the action via a screen in our lives, we were just more viscerally aware of what our bodies are saying and what our needs are, and how we're affected by our own consciousness.
And aligning with the natural rhythms of ourselves and our bodies, but the natural rhythms of the world, that we live in. And Layne called it, being in rhythm, and how do we align with that, with those rhythms? Yeah, when I mentioned before that we were born into this rhythmic world with the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars, and we live our lives to rhythm. A lot of the rhythms that we live our lives to are artificial. And so we turn the lights on at night, and I turn the air conditioning on when it gets too hot. So there have been ways, and then Native people here in Florida would just migrate to the coastal areas in the summer where it was cooler. So we are in a way responding to the natural rhythms, but we do separate ourselves from that a lot because of the demands of our modern world. And there's a lot of pain and death in those parts of ourselves that I think a lot of people are reclaiming. And, you had mentioned that the challenges of the pandemic going worldwide, from just the ability to receive all the supplies that we need to whether or not we still have the the income that we may be dependent on and the jobs. I know lots of people were furloughed right away, people who I know, and they really had to get creative about what they were going to do. That's tough, you know. That's definitely tough. And a lot of what Jeff and I went through in terms of our shifting, some of it had to do with COVID, but not all of it. Some of it just was more that we've been saying for a few years now that we can't keep up, and it was too much. And so what are we going to do? And it just kept growing and growing and growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, you know, it was just a matter of time before we could figure out how to make a change. I already made a change. In 2015, in that fall, I said, that's it, I need a break. I was really struggling with what I was supposed to be doing because a lot of what I was trying to do wasn't working anymore. Part of it had to do with, I was in Florida. It's a very different animal than Maine, and different demographic. And so they'd never heard of Gabrielle Roth. They'd never heard of Layne Redmond. They, you know, oh, drumming. And they see what happens on the beach every night at sunset. They think that's all there is to drumming. They don't know all these other aspects of it. And yet there were many people who did. So we had some wonderful successes. And then other things that I tried to do was just way too outside the box. So it was like, you know, and it's different here in the schools. 50% of my income was really the school programs, being an artist and resident, mostly elementary schools. And that was loads of fun, where I would show up. I was the coolest teacher with bags and bags of all the drums and bells and shakers. And that was so much fun. And Florida just sees arts enrichment very differently. And so I couldn't really get that going. So there was a lot of, you know, when you were mentioning before about like identity attachment. Well, gosh, well, this is who I am. This is what I do. And for me, there's no separation of who I am and what I do. This isn't a job for me. It's not a job. It's who I am. I'm an artist. I'm a teacher. I evolve. I follow the yeses. People call up and say, hey, can you work with our population? We have autistic kids, or we have at-risk youth, or we have here in Florida lots of memory care facilities and residences for seniors in assisted living. Yeah, I can do that. And so I just kept following where the demand was. And yet there was a lot that I had to offer that was, we called it the R word, rejection. And that is a huge part of people's lives when they live through a rejection, any kind of rejection. That's tough to take, whether it's in a relationship or in a job, or from a family member, or, you know, gosh, I hope you don't reject yourself. So that's really deep. And so I just needed to take some time for me. And at the same time, the ukulele was taking over the rhythm inlet, which had been focused on the drums and percussion, the folkloric styles from around the world. And something that you and I were going to talk about was how Jeff and I would travel to study these different traditions. We went to Belize for the West African drum traditions there among the Dangriga and Maroon peoples in two different locations of Belize. We went to Egypt with Layne Redmond and drummed in the ancient temples and performed ritual with her. We went to Brazil twice, to the Afro-Brazilian center of Brazil, Salvador, on the bay. And both trips were with Layne, but we also took extra time by ourselves to do our own thing. And, you know, we had this retail store, so we would bring suitcases of instruments back to then bring to our community and share and add that to our educational programs, where we would go to an elementary school and fill the stage with like 50 instruments and demonstrate on them and talk about them and play and have the kids come up on stage, just from all over the world. It was called Drums Heard Around the World. The Rhythm Inlet, our retail store, and the Rhythm Inlet programs, all of the classes and the school programs, etc., fell under the umbrella of the Rhythm Inlet programs, which included rhythm and movement and hand drumming and dance for people of all ages, abilities, and challenges, for your recreational, therapeutic, and educational settings. So that just kind of covered the gamut of it. And then there was this retail store, which was like a gallery museum that had everything. We didn't care if anybody was ever going to buy it. We had to have it because it was this unique instrument that came from this small portion of the world that people use, that people invented to express their culture through rhythm. And every traditional culture on the planet has some form of rhythm in its expression. Rhythmic chanting, rhythmic movement, rhythmic music. So we had to represent that. It's a universal language. And yet around the time that I was beginning my sabbatical from teaching, the timing was also good because the ukulele started to take over. For us, yet another form of folkloric music, because the power of rhythm is that we all have it, whether we know it or not. We are all born innately with the power to express ourselves through rhythm and to join in a group rhythmic activity. And the ukulele came along and it really took off. And that's actually why we could no longer keep up, because the ukulele exploded on the scene, bigger than the drumming did for us in terms of retail sales and classes in one location. Jeff never had to travel to teach ukulele. He could just teach right there in the middle of our store, 5-6 times a week. And we could host these ukulele heroes from all over the world. And thanks to the internet, they're known all over the world, these performers and teachers. And we could host them when they were coming through Florida on tour. We've been in Florida for 17 years now. And that was very exciting. And it was a lot for us to keep up with. So COVID did change that when all of the classes had to shift over to Zoom. That came with its own stresses, major. And, when you mentioned astrology before and Saturn. So when Saturn was approaching Aquarius, I was like, wow, I better watch out, because that'll be my second Saturn return. I wonder what that's going to be like. I didn't know that Jupiter was coming too. And I really didn't know that I was watching for Jeff because his birthday is January 21 and he was born at 0 degrees of Aquarius. I was like, honey, this is going to affect you. Little did I know that in another part of his chart, Pluto was going to slam Chiron, his wounded healer. And sure enough, he ended up in the hospital. So the stresses for us in September of 2020 were, I lived through a nightmare. That was a very scary time. I had my greatest fears at my doorstep. And I had already been through my dark night of the soul when I was stripped of all my identity. I took my sabbatical. I'm like, okay, this is the descent of Inanna. She goes to the 7 gates, and through each gate, she's stripped of yet another aspect of herself until she's just a slab of meat on a hook. And it's the frame drum that draws her back. Ooh.
Thank you so much, Barbara Gail, for joining us. It's been a fabulous time speaking with you. You're Barbara Gail.
Yeah, barbaragail.com. And the best thing to do is look on the calendar. I have some upcoming tambourine events, one for women only, one for men and women. Some are ceremonial, some are workshopy. Now the tambourine path is really taking off since Layne Redmond's induction into the Hall of Fame of the Percussive Arts Society, which was huge. And I was representing the Layne Redmond legacy, and Layne being the one teaching the workshop at that convention in Indianapolis. Yeah. But even before that, people were asking more and more for the tambourine. So the tambourine has really been calling, and that's what I've been working with for the most part. And it's exciting and fun. And that's where I'm getting invitations to be teaching around the country and around the world. So I'm waiting for that to happen. That will be really remarkable. I love to do that. And that's one reason why we closed our store, so that Jeff can travel with me and assist. It's going to be really fun to do that. So yeah, YouTube, Barbara Gail, the drum, the song, the dance, barbaragail.com.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning weekly show featuring guests who share their journeys and expertise, providing us with food for thought. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, Reiki and shamanic practitioner. You can find Healing Wisdom podcasts at WOMR.org or on Facebook and Instagram pages. We're listening to O Mashe Bello from Alessandro Esposito. You can find his music at soundcloud.com/Alessandro-Esposito-10.